Take it away,
Okay.
Foster.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. I always like doing these because in Mark's introduction, he adds to the number of books that I have written. So each time well, it's 16 or the next time it's 32. So it's magical exponential. But we're here tonight to talk about one book, a very special book, just recently published called The Method, How the 20th Century Learned to Act. And here's the book. It is absolutely first rate, and it is my pleasure to discuss the book now with the author, Isaac Butler, whom I do not know, and whom I am just meeting for the first time tonight. But I have read and admired your book enormously, Isaac. And my first question is probably a question you've been asked a lot of times. It's a daunting subject, and you approach it in a way that's different, I think, than it has been done before. What was the inspiration for you taking on this really difficult project?
That's a great question, Foster. But before I answer it, I'm going to filibuster for just one moment to say that I'm really grateful to Lambs Club for having me as a guest. It's really an honor, and it's also really an honor to talk to you. Foster's book about the actor studio, The Method to Their Madness, was incredibly important to my book. I cite it all over the place. I quote it in a few places. And so it's wonderful to finally actually get to meet you, having admired your work and had it be an influence on mine from afar. So just when you emailed me to say, hey, do you want to do this? I was like, I can't believe I'm going to get to talk to Foster Hirsch. So this is so exciting. Anyway, to your actual question, what inspired this? On a basic level, I have just always really been interested in stories of cultural change. I come from a theater background, so, preferably if they're related to theater, that helps too. But I've always been interested in stories of cultural change. And this just seemed like a really big one, that the story existed in lots of bits and pieces, but no one had kind of put it together. And that I was kind of uniquely suited, from the background that I have as both a writer and a theater professional, to kind of put those together. That was the early impulse. The second thing was that once I started digging into the story, I discovered that it was just filled with really outsized personalities and a lot of great conflicts between those personalities. And that's when I knew it would be a fun story to research, and one that could be written about in an entertaining way that people would actually, hopefully, if I did it right, want to read, because there's a lot of kind of heady, higher level concepts being explored in it. What is a human being? What is creativity? How do those work? And so I wanted to make sure that it would still be a compelling story, but there has to be a compelling story to tell in order to be able to tell it compellingly. There's also a personal angle, which is that I studied, I wouldn't call it the method exactly, but I studied Stanislavski-based acting technique as a teenager. It's been very important to me. I have both negative and positive experiences of it. And I've always just sort of wanted to know, where did that come from? So even though I'm not in the book, it's sort of like all writing is autobiography, whether you want it or not. I'm trying to sort of research my own story and how I got to where I am.
What's fascinating about the book is it really is built in terms of chapters or units, and we start in Russia, and then we go to the group theater, and then the actor studio, and then the new Hollywood. I see it as more or less a book in 4 parts, but what's interesting is that in each part you sort of find a star personality. But what I liked about the book is, frankly, when I started, I thought, oh, he's going to write as a fan, and everything is going to be all these people just wonderful and idealistic. And in fact, that's not the case at all. You're sort of critical of everybody. And I like that. It's a very dimensional portrait of complicated and creative people, but they're all difficult personalities, and you don't pretend otherwise.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. I worked hard at that. I didn't want this to be a work of hagiography. I wanted it to be a work of honest storytelling. And, even though I really do admire almost every person who makes an appearance in this book. There are some I don't, but for the most part, I at least find something about them admirable. They were all complicated and in many cases very difficult people. I think the impact that Stanislavski, to take Constantine Stanislavski, creator of the system, founder of the Moscow Art Theater, almost all Western theatrical practice owes an enormous debt to Stanislavski. It's the foundation of American dramatic writing, acting, directing, dramaturgy is Stanislavski at this point, and I admire that man greatly, but the idea of working with him, the idea of it seems very
Isaac,
difficult.
You admire him, but the portrait that emerges is one that I hadn't been in touch with before, because I did.
Thank you.
I studied Stanislavski for my own book, but
yeah, of course,
portrait is much more dimensional. He was very insecure, and he was very uncertain about so many things, and he did not like to be challenged. I had this idealistic picture of him as a man who said the system is an unending process and all dissent is welcome. Not really. He didn't like to be contradicted.
It's interesting. He didn't want to be contradicted within his own company. But if you were like an intellectual, if you were part of the intelligentsia and you wrote an article criticizing the system, he might like take you out to coffee and pick your brain about it. He was interested in exploring all the possibilities of his ideas, but within the actual professional context of the Moscow Art Theater. By his own admission in his own memoir, he was a dictator. He keeps talking about himself. A despot is the word that he uses. And
he was a Russian autocrat, and we know what that's like from the headlines today. And in fact, that part of your book gains a kind of impact which you couldn't have known when you were writing about it.
No.
Because I kept reading part one against contemporary headlines, and the politics that you deal with the Moscow Art Theater and the Bolshevik Revolution is eerily familiar from what we're reading in the newspapers as we speak.
Yes. I mean, obviously, I would rather give up that contemporary resonance and not have, Russia's invasion of Ukraine going on right now. But I find Russian culture and Russian society fascinating. It was probably the area of the book that I knew the least about going into researching and writing it. And it's so fascinating because it is so different from other European countries during the same period. It's sort of a hyper-modern and a medieval country simultaneously in the 19th century, and there's ways that it mirrors America, like, their slavery system ends in the 1860s, for example, in the early 1860s, for example, and so I just found that culture really fascinating. And I thought that if I could find the parts of it that were really interesting to me while telling the story, and then tell those parts, the reader would find them interesting too. Like, you have to follow your interest to a certain extent and rely upon it. And that cultural shift from about 1860 to about 1920, starting with the liberation of the serfs, and then there's a sort of U-turn into a reactionary authoritarian regime after Alexander II is assassinated, and Alexander III, whose nickname is the Colossus, takes over. And then, of course, we move into Nicholas. Everyone knows about Tsar Nicholas. And then the revolution and the Civil War and Lenin and Stalin. The fact that people lived through all of that and made art through all of that and figured out how to survive through all of that. Not that everyone did figure out how to survive through all that.
But not everybody did survive.
No,
Meyerhold didn't survive. Stanislavski did. But didn't he survive by not taking sides? He was not political, and he did not want to be involved in politics. And to some extent, he succeeded in rising above the politics of the revolution.
Yeah, it's really interesting. When you read stuff about Stanislavski written during his life, or really written up until, I'd say, maybe the 1980s, the idea of him is that he's this very naive, his nickname among his friends is the big infant. He's this naive, childlike guy, sort of like, I don't really know about politics. All I care about is art. But it's hard to imagine someone surviving and thriving and having a theater that was at the forefront. I mean, he was a celebrity during this whole, celebrity artist during this whole period, and survive the Colossus and Nicholas and the Revolution, all of these things, if that's really the case. If he really was
so obviously shrewd as hell.
Exactly.
Shrewd.
That's my feeling.
But he did not want to be overtly political at all.
And the one real hint that we have a few hints about how shrewd he was. He kept icons hidden in his apartment during the end of his life. He had Russian Orthodox icons hidden in the doors of a wardrobe. You know, he probably, although we don't know for sure, was protecting Meyerhold, because Meyerhold disappears into the gulag about 6 months after Stanislavski dies. And there's also this really interesting article that I found from the 1950s that Joshua Logan wrote in the New York Times. And Joshua Logan actually studied with Stanislavski a little bit and spent some time at the Moscow Art Theater. And he said that Stanislavski would criticize Stalin. He would do it, but only if he was in his office alone with you, with soundproof curtains closed.
Yeah.
You know, and so I do agree. My feeling is that you have to have been shrewd to survive all that stuff. No one survives all that stuff by accident.
No, but he was a brilliant strategist.
Yes.
Now let me put you on the spot.
Sure.
If you were to tell our audience, and we have a very theater savvy audience in the Lambs, people know a lot. If you were to succinctly say what Stanislavski's contribution was to the art of acting, what were his 2 or 3 most important contributions to the process of studying how to become an actor?
Well, one of the big ones was just actually all sorts of stuff that predates his system, that has to do with the creation of what is really the modern rehearsal period, and the modern director, actor, designer relationship really comes out of the Moscow Art Theater. You know, no one really had done, I mean, he invented table work. Those of you, the rehearsal process divided in equal fourths between breaking down a text, blocking it, refining the blocking, and then refining the whole thing through run-throughs and tech. That's his rehearsal process. So there's that. But with the invention of the system, he pioneers, codifies, he would not say invents, but maybe invents a number of key things. He's the first, Western, I hate using the word Western, but it's convenient here. He's the first to really come up with a training system and a technique that activates and trains the inner life of the actor as a creative artist. So that's one thing. And there's a whole number of things that he's doing there that we can get to in detail, but you asked me to be succinct. And the other thing is that he creates the modern practice of script analysis, the idea of breaking a script down into beats, that your character has a thing they want, and then things they're doing to get the things they want. And then if you line all of those things up together, you get the through line of action, which is the part, all of those sorts of, objectives, actions, problems, the through line of action, beats, the given circumstances. Stanislavski codifies all of that. So it's really sort of 3 buckets: the 20th century rehearsal process, the 20th century way of looking at text, and the training of the internal mechanism of the actor.
Didn't he also do something incredibly important to the profession? He treated the actor as a creative person, not as an imitator. And before that, I don't think actors had that kind of legitimacy, that he was saying, in effect, actors, we are artists.
Mm-hmm. I think that's absolutely true. And that's actually sort of one of the things that becomes controversial in the States in the 20th century. It's like, are we craftspeople who have a job to do, or are we artists and personal expression matters? But no, Stanislavski really believed that actors were artists, and he became more and more convinced of that over the course of his career. When the Moscow Art Theater was started, it was started as a literary theater. The idea was that everything was done at the service of great literature, and through that, he kind of found his way back to, but the brilliance of the actor is what's actually going to serve this literature. And it led to a real spat, a decades-long argument between him and Vladimir Nemirovich Donchenko, who's the co-founder of the Moscow Art Theater. I mean, for the last 20 years of their relationship, they basically didn't speak. I mean, they would be in the same administrative offices together, communicating via letter. That's how much they hated each other, and yet they were running a theater at the same time. And a lot of that debate was because Stanislavski was an actor and director, and Nemirovich was a critic and a playwright. And Nemirovich was like, this is a temple to literature. Why are you turning it into the home of the actor? Stanislavski was like, because this is what we need to do.
But Isaac, that's a very good segue to part 2, which is the group theater. elemental rivalries and intensities and passionate dislikes among creative people. All of those were formed in the group theater between Stella Adler and Lee Strasberg, who truly, absolutely despised each other.
Yeah, can I ask you a question here?
Personally and professionally, and it was never healed. It was never resolved.
No.
I was in Stella Adler's class because she had allowed me to observe her classes for my book that you referred to on the day that Strasberg died. And she came into the class, and of course, everybody applauded. She was the queen. And we knew she was going to say something about the death. She would have to. Long, brilliant pause. And she said, it will take the American theater decades to recover from the damage that man has caused. That was it.
Yep. And, earlier that day, I interviewed Moni Yakim, who's a movement teacher, one of the founding teachers of Juilliard, but was also a friend of Stella's and taught at her conservatory. And Moni was in the room when she got the phone call that Strasberg had died. It was Mario Saletti, the great Shakespeare teacher, called her to say, Stella Lee's died. And she talked to him for a little bit, and she set down the phone and she said, "Good riddance. Now he will finally stop ruining actors." Which is
she said basically the same thing in her class. She was consistent.
You interviewed Lee. So did you, when you talked to him about Stella, did he do that weird thing where he wouldn't use her name? Where he would say an American actress I worked with instead of saying Stella Adler?
He would not use her name, and there were long pauses.
Yeah.
The subtext was bubbling over. Now,
I dug
was
through
more frank than Strasberg. She was more open.
Yeah.
And so her dislike was front and center. His was covered. But can you tell our viewers, Isaac,
sure,
the basic conflict between the method according to Stella and the method according to Lee? Can it be broken down into a basic central disagreement about the creative process?
Sure. I mean, okay, so even though I'm a Jew, I'm going to use a Christian metaphor here that, the core of the conflict is faith versus deeds. Really, it's that Protestant conflict of, are we saved through faith or saved through deeds? I like to think about it as both of them kind of broke off part of the system and ran with it, because the system have dozens and dozens and dozens of components, and they each had one part of it that they were really interested in. Strasberg was really interested in the individual psychology, idiosyncrasy, and emotional reality of the actor, and the way the actor is the material of their art. So they're both the painter and the paint. And so he would always use this metaphor of colors. So if you think about it, you're digging into yourself to put as many colors on that paint palette as possible. So when you go and he would do this through a series of exercises that were, each successive one gets you kind of deeper and deeper and deeper into using your own memories and your own emotions to unlock the idiosyncrasies of behavior. Is most famous, or perhaps most infamous, for the affective memory exercise, where you coach someone to call forth a powerful emotion by remembering a time in your life associated with that profound emotion. But you don't do it by just like telling the story. He actually didn't want you to tell the story. You focus on recalling the sensory details of that memory, and then you essentially trigger yourself. I've done it. You can do it. It's different people have different facility for it, but that was his sort of most famous exercise. Stella,
isn't that Pavlovian in a way?
Well, it's funny. It was originally, Strasberg said it was Pavlovian. When Stanislavski developed various effective memory ideas, and he didn't do it quite that way. You didn't really go fishing for it in that way exactly. But when Stanislavski developed effective memory as part of the system, he was basing it on the French psychologist Théodule Ribot. Ribot has a wonderful couple of essays where he kind of talks about the idea of effective memory, and they were very inspiring to Stanislavski. Stanislavski never read Freud. Ever. So when he's talking about the things that aren't in the conscious mind, he's not talking about the Freudian idea of the subconscious. Of course, Strasberg read Freud. He was very into Freud. There's a psychoanalytic component to the method. But the other thing is that after Stalin came to power, Stanislavski had to reframe his ideas in terms of Pavlov. So the language that he used around effective memory changes. He starts calling it emotion memory, and it's about triggering and stimulus response and all this stuff, which was not how he originally described it, but it's because French bourgeois psychology was not going to fly under social realism. And so he really had to reframe all those ideas. It goes back to how shrewd he was, and in the way he handled it was like, oh, I've just discovered it really comes from Pavlov. And Strasberg would talk about it in Pavlovian terms too, yes.
But can I just ask, Strasberg's emphasis on recovery of emotion and expression of emotion, I'm convinced had a deeply rooted personal source, because this was a man who had no affect. The face was blank. He had such problem expressing emotion that
except
it became
anger.
The central, except anger and rage. But warmth, humor, kindness, that didn't come through. You saw this man with no expression. And so he had forced on his actors the challenge and the problem of dredging up emotion because it was his central life issue.
Yeah, I mean, that is an accusation that followed him for decades. I mean, I think you make it very eloquently and convincingly in your book. Sanford Meisner felt the same way, and so did Bobby Lewis. They all thought that it was because of the traumas of his home life. Lee Strasberg was an immigrant from a Polish shtetl. He grew up quite poor. He he grew up in an immigrant, very silent immigrant family. He would say that he never really learned social graces because there was no warmth in his home. The only real loving relationship he had was his older brother Zalman. And Zalman died of the Spanish flu when Strasberg was in high school, and it really ruined him on some level emotionally. I mean, he was open about that it really broke him. He dropped out of high school. He became an autodidact, and all these other things. It really set him on his path. It's it's in some ways the core trauma. And he was just a very peculiar piece that even people who love Lee, and I mean, this is something that comes out in your book as well, even people who loved him very deeply would be like, I mean, of course, he's incredibly unpleasant to be around. It's just like it's a bit,
where Stella was this grand diva. Yeah. The emotion was flooding out of her. She was overly theatrical.
Yes.
But one loved her. There was enormous warmth and enormous personality. It was just the opposite. They were oil and water, their two personalities.
And they were never going to get along. They weren't going to get along for a bunch of different reasons. One of them was that Stella was actually more experienced theatrically and professionally at the founding of the group. She'd been acting professionally since the age of 5. She'd been on Broadway many times. She had a child. She had been Sergei Prokofiev's lover. She had lived a lot of life. And she was like, these people are nobodies and I am a queen. She said that, overtly to Helen Krichnoy, for that book Reunion. And so she didn't want to take it on faith that this, pisher who didn't know anything, who had never proven himself, knew what he was talking about. And furthermore, she didn't have any problem expressing emotion on stage. So when Strasberg would try to do the effective memory stuff, she was like, I don't need this. And as the years in the group went on and they fought and fought and fought, she came to believe, as she would say many times over her life, and I'm sure she said to you, that he was a sick man inflicting his sickness through his sick technique. She would always use the word sick, and that he was practicing unlicensed psychotherapy. And so she's really pissed about this stuff, and she really feels like she's lost her way as an actor. She really doesn't know what she's doing. And so in the mid 1930s, she and Harold Clurman are in Paris on vacation, and Jacques Capot, the great director and critic and uncle of Michel Saint-Denis, is old friends with Clurman, and he says, Harold, I can't do a French accent. Constantine Stanislavski is actually here in Paris. Why don't you go look him up and talk to him? And so they go talk to him, and he's there with Olga Knipper-Chekova, Anton Chekhov's widow, who's also a star member of the MAT, and a doctor because he had terrible health problems. And they're at this meeting, and Stella won't talk to him, and she won't even shake his hand. And he looks at her and he says, in French, they spoke French because Stanislavski didn't speak English and she didn't speak Russian. Young lady, everyone here has said something to me, but you, what's the matter? And she says, Mr. Stanislavski, I used to love acting before I studied your system. And now that I have, it has ruined me and sucked all the joy out of my life. And now I hate acting. And he said, well, if it doesn't work for you, forget it. but maybe you've been mistaught it. So why don't you come study with me tomorrow and we'll work on a scene together? And they worked together for several weeks. And then when she came back to the United States to a meeting at the group theater, she told them, lo and behold, Lee's gotten everything wrong. Stanislavski's emphasis is not on effective memory. He uses it, but it's not the core of the system. The core of the system is textual analysis, the problem, action, given circumstances, imagination, research. That's the core of the system.
Not inner emotion.
Not inner emotion.
Actor's inner life.
No,
not
and actually,
the actor's inner life.
No, she thought the actor needed to have a rich inner life, but it was not that they should use that inner life for the part. It's that they should be worldly, knowledgeable, scholar, artist, gentleman knights. You know what I mean? It's like, and so
she would always tell students when I was in her class to get out of themselves.
Yeah.
And said to students who were trying to mumble and do, quotes the method, she said, everything is Hoboken to you.
Amazing. Yeah. I mean, it's incredible. And so she, in the early days after she comes back from Paris, she is not saying don't use effective memory at all. She's saying this exercise, let's not do this exercise anymore. But she became more and more hardened. I think the other thing, is that because of this schism, they become more and more hardened and further apart in their opinions. I think if they hadn't hated each other, they probably could have figured out some synthesis. But by the time you get to the 70s, there's a New York Times article profiling her where she's in class and the student has to look out a window and see this lake that's in Switzerland. And Stella goes, "What was that? What was that, crap doing? What were you seeing out the window?" And the actor says, "Well, I've actually been to Switzerland. I've actually seen this lake. So I was picturing the lake because I've actually seen it." Right. And she said, "Don't ever do that. Make up a lake in Morocco and see that out of the window, a Moroccan lake, not a lake you've really been to, because your personal experience is too small and it is not worthy of art. And so imagination is how you become worthy of art, because art is bigger and more important and more special and more beautiful than real life." That was really her point of view.
Okay. Now I want to ask you,
Yeah.
You've spent a lot of time, you've lived with these people as biographers do. My sense is from the book, you were not crazy about Strasberg and might not have liked him had you known him, but you also had reservations about Stella. You thought she was awfully grand, which she certainly was. If you were an acting student, which one would you have studied with?
Oh, I would have absolutely studied with Stella, and I would have been madly in love with her. I mean, there are many people I quote in the book who had problems with her grand performance, but I just know if I was like 22, I would have been like, this is the coolest shit I've ever seen in my life. This woman is crazy. It's so delightful. It's so charming. She's so brilliant. I really like, I went to the Ransom Center and I watched videos of Stella lecturing. I mean, she's so brilliant. She's such a brilliant thinker. The thing that I was trying to capture with Lee is that I doubt I would have liked him very much. He's not a very likable person. He wasn't that interested in being liked, but I have immense respect for what he achieved, and I think there are parts of that technique that were not useful for everyone. I don't think everyone, even it's in your book as well, where people would give you quotes like, "Oh, he's a genius," but not everyone should study with him. You should study with him if you have your psychological house in order, if you don't mind digging deep. There's other people you can study with who are great if you want to do other stuff. And many people, Ellen Burstyn, Shelley Winters, people like that did study with multiple people. But I do have immense respect for him, even though if I wouldn't want to hang out with him, I have immense respect for him. The person who is only a minor figure in the book, who I really grew to love through reading his writing and stuff, is Bobby Lewis. I think Bobby Lewis's writing about acting is actually, out of all the people who come out of the group theater, it is the clearest and the most useful. His book Method or Madness and Advice to the Players, those two books are some of the most concrete, tangible, lucid. They're very funny. He's very charming ways of looking at how Stanislavski can help you as an actor. And if I was teaching acting, I'd assign them. But I think, Stella's way with text, her way of thinking about text it's so brilliant. I learned so much as a writer and thinker from reading that stuff.
Would Strasberg and Adler agree about what good acting is if they just saw the performance, not how the actor got there, but what they saw on screen or stage? If they saw a performance, would they both agree it is a great performance and that the actor was doing what they were trying to get actors to do in their classes?
I think for
But they agree on good acting.
I think for the most I think for the most part, yes. I'm going to caveat. I have a caveat coming up, but I would say, you read this stuff from when they were seeing theater together and stuff like that, and they were actually very aligned on a lot of things. When they went to Moscow, they liked the same things and disliked the same things. They paid a joint social call on Vakhtangov's widow to pay their respects. They both loved the acting of Marlon Brando. There's lots of stuff. Stella was very interested in the actor serving the world and ideas and style of the writer. So the thing that she would not have been into was that very internalized method style applied to anything other than mid-20th century American naturalism, really. Like, you can't do a Doll's House like that. She would be like, don't do that. You know what I mean? So that's where I think it would have broken down. But particularly, up until the 1940s, I think they would have had a lot of agreement over what good acting.
And were they after the same thing, truthful, emoting on stage? They had different ways of getting there.
Yes.
But the goal was very aligned.
Yeah, that's what's so wild about this. That's why it's an almost like religious schism. It's because they're both going to the same place. The same place they're going is the thing that unifies all of the ideas that come out of Stanislavski in the United States and elsewhere, which is this Russian word, perezhevania. And perezhevania loosely translates as experiencing or re-experiencing. And it's when the actor has so fully entered into the imagined reality of the character that they're not becoming the character fully, because that's just badness, but they are really experiencing in a truthful way what the character is going through, and she just felt like you didn't have to use yourself and your own experiences and effective memory and everything to get there. In fact, she thought it wouldn't get you there. It would hamper you. But there were lots of people who studied with them both and found value from them both. Ellen Burstyn, probably of everyone alive, the most devoted to Lee Strasberg and his techniques of memory. But she studied with Stella Adler too. And she said, Stella and Lee are talking about the same thing. You use her imagination to get to his psychology, or you can use his psychology to get to her imagination. They're just talking about the same thing. They're going the same place. These are both useful.
Yeah, okay, chapter 3. The Actors Studio.
Yeah. What a wild organization, my friend.
What a wild organization, but we have to bring in a new character, Kazan.
Yeah.
And he becomes the central player. Really, it's his work that makes the method world famous. His series of films and plays, but certainly Streetcar, Baby Doll, On the Waterfront, East of Eden. That's how the world first becomes familiar with what is called method acting. So he supplants Strasberg and Adler. He becomes the biggest star of all.
Yeah,
and he's also a very complicated man, about whom one, of course, could have very complicated and divided feelings.
Yeah, I mean, he had complicated and divided feelings about himself. If you've ever read his memoir, which is sort of like, I mean, the sort of darkest things ever written by Kazan are by Kazan in that memoir. I feel like Kazan has an interesting arc. He starts as an intern at the group. His nickname at that time is Gadget, or Gadge. People called him Gadge because he's so useful and friendly and everyone loves him. And then he's in Waiting for Lefty, which makes him a star overnight. And it unlocks something in him, a far more ambitious, far darker, far more self-centered, and far more driven human being emerges after that point. And he claims in his memoir that that version of him was really his true self, and that he had been hiding from it all his life in this sort of friendly persona. And so he becomes this very driven, ambitious guy. And he's also a genius. He's the best director to come out of the group. And so as soon as the group ends, he eclipses the rest of the members like that. He goes to, he becomes this, the boy genius of Broadway who can save any play that's in trouble. You bring him in and it's going to be great and it's going to sell well. He goes to Hollywood and does Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which is a wonderful film. As particularly as debut films go, it's very impressive. All this stuff is happening. And part of why all this stuff is happening is that Kazan wants to be totally independent, to do whatever he wants, and to be the central defining force of whatever he's doing. He says that very openly. And So he gets together with Bobby Lewis and Cheryl Crawford from the group because they want to found an organization that will exist to provide continuing opportunities for working professional actors to refine their craft. And the idea is actually very pure. It's like, let's get back to what the group theater did well and leave out all the producing pressure shit that tore the group apart. And so it's an organization where no one pays anything unless they're currently acting in a show. No one gets paid to work there. You know, they meet 2 times a week. There's a beginner class and an intermediate class, etc. He and Bobby Lewis have a falling out a year after the actor studio is founded. Bobby Lewis quits. They don't speak for about 4 years, and they reconcile. And when they're searching for a new teacher, Kazan brings Strasberg in. And Kazan
but he brings Strasberg in because Kazan himself is too busy professionally to do the work that's needed.
And he is beginning to doubt.
Strasberg had failed.
Yes.
He was sort of in a has-been category at that point.
And Kazan felt like he was not a good teacher. Kazan had begun to feel like he was not a good teacher. And furthermore, he didn't want to be an acting teacher. He wanted to be the world's most important theater and film director, which he became for a decade. There's about a decade period where he is both the best working stage and screen director in America simultaneously.
Nobody else can claim that.
Nobody else can claim that. It's remarkable. It's remarkable what he was able to achieve. And so the thing that's happening is, you know, the actor studio is supposed to be this pure temple to art, but Kazan is casting people he's discovering there. And he's using the actor studio to develop work. Camino Real, for example, developed there. It didn't start there, but it developed there. And then he's putting those shows on Broadway. So everyone who wants to have a career wants to audition for the actor studio. And then once that happens, it becomes this kind of crazy perpetual motion machine because everyone's auditioning for it. So they can take the best people. And then the best people, you know, that final audition, it's just Strasberg and Kazan and Crawford making those decisions about who gets in. And then it creates all this energy, all this great energy. So they start this directors unit that trains like every important director, and this writers unit. Every playwright you can name from that period is going through this writers unit. And it's this weird thing that then it's like, okay, now we actually have all the components to create a really brilliant ensemble producing theater. This is, I'm saying, in like the mid 1950s. And right when that's going to happen, Strasberg gets freaked out and gets cold feet and sort of backs away from it because he's so afraid of humiliation and of being exposed because he had so many bad experiences of his plays flopping. And he's so worried about the actor studio looking bad that it screws up every attempt to try to get productions off the ground. To give one example, the Jack Garfein one, which I'm sure you know well, you know, Jack Garfein develops a play at the studio. It gets produced off Broadway that he's directing. And it's not until the play is a hit that they will allow the actor studio name to be associated with the production. Even though it started at the studio, all the actors from the studio, the directors from the studio, playwrights in the studio. So then it comes time for them to do a second play, and Jack Garfein's like, okay, I'll do it. It's an actor studio production of this new Jack Garfein's doing an O'Neill play. And as soon as that name is on it, Lee starts interfering. He gets very anxious and he starts interfering with the directing of the play to such an extent that Garfein walks off the production. And then Paula Strasberg, Lee's wife, decides to punish Garfein. And so she does two things that led to a huge falling out that lasted for about a decade. The first is she calls the New York Times. She calls Brooks Atkinson, if I remember correctly. And she says, all that stuff that you said Jack Garfein did in the staging, my husband actually did after he quit. And Brooks Atkinson said, I've seen Jack Garfein staging. I've seen your husband staging. I know it was Jack Garfein. I can tell. And then the other thing that she did is she spread a rumor that Jack Garfein, who was a Holocaust survivor, had lied about being in the Holocaust. And he was so furious, justifiably, that he quit the studio and didn't speak to them for a decade. The fact that they reconciled at all is a fucking miracle, really. Excuse my language. And so, stuff like that kept happening. They kept having this struggle with production.
Struggles, Isaac, are so fundamental to Strasberg's temperament. The struggles are over and over again.
I know.
Difficult man's ego.
Yes, and his unwillingness to, his feeling that there were certain things that he was owed, that he deserved, and that he sometimes he was right about that, but that doesn't mean that you get to act like you should be given something. Like you still have to work. Like we've all gone through periods of life where we feel like we have earned something that we shouldn't have to work for anymore, and it's time for someone to just give it to you. But that's not how the world works. You know what I mean? That's just not how the world works, and he couldn't accept that.
He demanded being appreciated, and when it didn't happen, there were consequences. But I want to focus for a minute on Kazan's films, because that's how the world got to know the method.
Yeah.
And you say something that I absolutely disagree with. I think it's wonderful to disagree, but your opinion of James Dean is not shared by me. He's original. I think he's brilliant. I think his work hasn't dated. I think East of Eden is one of the greatest films ever made, and that performance is indelible. And you don't feel that way. And we like each other. We're happy to disagree, but I think you're wrong.
You know what I appreciate about this is that if this was the group theater, we would be screaming and throwing things at each other, right? Because that's how they did conflict. But we could just be like, yeah, I don't like James Dean very much. It's true. I think
that comes across.
Yeah. I mean, to me, the essence of Dean, and he was accused of this at his own time. I'm not making this up, obviously, but the essence of Dean is that he didn't really have much technique. He was an inspiration player. And when he was inspired, he could be quite brilliant. I actually think I'm going to go to bat for his performance in Giant. I actually think he's quite good in Giant. I think Giant points
brilliant. I think that's an underrated performance. And he's brilliant as an old man in the second part of the film.
Yeah, no, I think Giant is the movie that makes, well, I'm sad about his death because it's sad when people die young. Don't get me wrong. Just because I don't like him as an actor doesn't mean I'm happy he died in a car crash. But Giant shows you that he could be on the way to being something really fascinating. I mean, I think if it weren't for the mythology around him, I would kind of treat those as like the first two movies, he's kind of learning how to act. And then in the third one, he kind of starts to figure it out or something. But, he becomes such a totemic symbol of the method. But to me, what he does two really, regardless of whether you like his performances or not, he's an important figure and he does two really important things. One is he codifies the external stylistic signs of the method because he's so indebted to Brando and to Clift, and he's mixing them together. And so now people know, like, what is method male acting? It's acting that looks like James Dean in those movies. Do you know what I mean? Like, he really does that. And then because he's younger, well, also and playing teenagers, even though he was older than that, but although he's playing teenagers in those first two films, and because he's so beautiful and there's this kind of romantic legend around him and all of this stuff, he makes the method something adolescent at exactly the moment that youth culture is becoming a thing in America, right? He is making the method part of youth culture. And without that, I don't know that we would be talking about it today. I mean, I do think he's an absolutely important figure. I just don't like his performances in East of Eden or Rebel Without a Cause. They mystify me on some level.
But you're also a little lukewarm about Brando after his initial period of creativity. Whereas I've seen all the Brando performances. I don't think he ever walked through a performance. He always had an interesting or innovative idea about every single performance. He's the greatest actor in the history of films, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, the thing with Brando,
the greatest performance I have ever seen, and Mr. Kazan agrees with me, is Terry Malloy on the Waterfront.
It's incredible. It's incredible. It's incredible. And Streetcar as well, which I spend more time on in the movie just because in the book, just because I feel like it's a really clear example of some of the things I'm talking about thematically in the book. I could have easily written 6 times that amount about every scene. I could have done a close reading of Terry Malloy because it's such a brilliant performance. I think there's great stuff after 1960. There's great stuff that I don't get into, like, that 5-minute scene at the beginning of Fugitive Kind. The 5-minute monologue to the camera is incredible. I actually love his Brutus, or his Mark Antony and Julius Caesar. I think is a really underrated performance. I think it's really
I'll go further than that. I like his Napoleon and Desiree.
Oh, amazing. But there is a period where, yes, in the 60s, he's often doing something interesting, but it almost seems to be breaking or subverting. Like, it's at war with his mischievousness sometimes gets the best of him. That's all I'm going to say. And there, of course, are some duds, like Viva Zapata is kind of hard to watch these days. It's kind
Yes,
of hard to watch, with all those prosthetics. But I also think I'm going to go to bat for a post-Godfather performance, because often the narrative is, and then after the Godfather, he kind of lost his way again. But I love Arthur Penn's revisionist Western, The Missouri Breaks. And that's one where what Penn has done is created, I don't talk about it in the book because it's a big book. I got a lot to cover. Do you know what I mean? But in The Missouri Breaks, Penn creates this brilliant container for Brando's mischievousness, because the character he's playing is a mercurial, mischievous genius. And if you haven't seen The Missouri Breaks and you're watching this, go out and find it. It's a little hard to find because it's not streaming usually, but if you can rent it sometimes on Amazon or whatever, go out and watch it. Marlon Brando is playing a bounty hunter in the Old West who's kind of a brilliant actor himself. And the character, it's never made clear whether the character is Irish or is pretending to be Irish to get by as a joke. So he speaks with this thick Irish brogue. And then later on in the movie, he has to go in disguise as an American in the West. And so he does this voice, which is an Irishman. So Marlon Brando is an American, pretending to be an Irishman, pretending to be an American. And he somehow nails what an Irishman doing a bad job of an American accent would sound like. I mean, it's startling what he does in that movie. Jack Nicholson's great in it. Randy Quaid's great in it. So it's not that there are no good performances after that. It's just that there is this initial period of genius that's hard to compare, of that first decade of his film career. And it's hard to compare almost anything else to what he achieves during that time.
I don't think there's a record that can compare with Brando in the 50s.
Yeah.
From Streetcar through Fugitive Kind. It's unsurpassed in American film in terms of creativity. Just quickly, the last part of your book, New Hollywood, and you, if I'm correct, you place Raging Bull as a kind of apex and termination point for, quotes, the method. Is that an accurate reading?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, there's a weird thing that happens in Raging Bull, which is that Raging Bull stars Robert De Niro, who did not like Lee Strasberg or the Actors Studio particularly, although he spent some time there and he would do benefits for them and stuff. But I get the sense that was mostly as a favor to Al Pacino because they were good friends. Robert De Niro actually studied with Stella Adler, not with Lee Strasberg. And at that point, when you say the method, really what we're talking about is Lee Strasberg's version of Stanislavski. Stella Adler would not use that term. She was opposed to it. Their Stella Adler technique. So he studied with her and he took her ideas of research and studying behavior and script analysis and stuff like that about as far as they could possibly go. I would guess further than she would think was really appropriate, frankly. Through a series of films, and I detail the evolution of his process over the course of the 1970s in a chapter about him in the book. So I won't get into it in detail here, but it culminates in Raging Bull. And many people know the mythology around Raging Bull, but that was his project. He had been given the book. He wanted to make it into a movie. He hired Scorsese to direct it. Originally Mardik Martin wrote a screenplay, then Paul Schrader wrote a screenplay, and then actually, although Schrader's the credited writer, Scorsese and De Niro did a full rewrite of the film together in the Virgin Islands somewhere. He lived with Jake LaMotta for a period of time. The person he was playing, he lived with Jake LaMotta's ex-wife for a period of time. He learned how to box. He took on a boxing training regimen. He punched Jake LaMotta's teeth out at one point. He did all of this kind of, and then when he was on set, he would refuse to break character and you had to refer to him as Jake or Champ. And the people who were on set at the time were like, that guy was really scary to be around. I'm going to be totally honest, because he was so in the zone with that character. And then filming stops for a few months so that Robert De Niro can eat anything he can get his hands on in France and Italy. And he gains 60 pounds to play the late in life Jake LaMotta. And it's an incredible, it's still shocking today when you watch it. And, even longtime champions of De Niro's like Pauline Kael were horrified actually by his performance, by what he had done to his body. And it gave him health problems, but it also won him the Oscar for Best Actor. It also catapulted him, from then on, he's talked about as the greatest living screen actor. That sort of fades in his cash-in period in the 21st century. But, it becomes a really important landmark film, and his process, which is not the method. This is why it becomes a sort of termination point for the method. That process becomes hugely influential. And after it has that influence, it becomes increasingly what the public thinks the method is, even though the method is something completely different. And not that long after that time, Lee dies. And, Meisner technique, Adler technique, and the method all struggle to some extent once their charismatic founders have died.
But we haven't mentioned Meisner yet, and he's such an important figure.
He's absolutely such
from the group. He's the third great acting teacher of the 20th century. Are students being trained in the Strasberg method, the Adler technique, and the Meisner technique as we speak?
Yes, they are. They're no longer the dominant. It's no longer, if you want to be an actor, you have to come to New York and study with someone who's going to teach you Stanislavski. That's no longer true. That era is over. There is no dominant. We don't live in an era of dominant paradigms in any field of American life. So acting's no different, But you are absolutely able to study Meisner, Adler, or Strasberg technique. It's actually probably easiest to study Meisner technique. There are a lot of Meisner technique teachers out there. He has had enormous influence in acting teaching and in film acting, particularly with his emphasis on spontaneity and being really present in the moment with your scene partner and all that sort of stuff. I love Sandy's books. I've talked to his former students. His approach is really fascinating to me. He is part of the book. We just haven't talked about him tonight. I'm not ignoring his, just so you know, the book does not ignore his place and importance in the history. And of course, he and Stella were good friends, and he hated Lee Strasberg. Strasberg technique.
But he's a less problematic personality than either Strasberg or Adler, meaning maybe less theatrical or less grand.
Yeah, he didn't really care about being famous or important. He just wanted to keep his nose down and train actors and do a good job. I mean, he had an ego. I mean, you have to have an ego to be an acting teacher, but he was, he had a different perspective on things. He just wanted to do his work. Everyone I've talked to who knew him said that like, he didn't want to get involved in that. He didn't like Lee, and he would, if you asked him for a quote about it, he'd talk about it, but he didn't want to get involved in that fight. That wasn't interesting to him. He just wanted to teach. And he taught generations of actors at the Neighborhood Playhouse, which still exists. You can take Meisner technique at the Neighborhood Playhouse and countless other places. Strasberg technique is still taught at the Lee Strasberg Institute of Theater and Film in New York and LA. It's taught at the Actors Studio MFA program, and bits and pieces of it. There's other places that you can learn it, particularly effective memory exercises. That's taught all over the place. Although that's not the entirety of the method. Adler technique is probably the least present as a codified thing today. The Stella Adler Conservatory no longer dogmatically teaches, and I don't mean dogmatically, I mean that descriptively. They know it's no longer the home where they just teach Adler technique. There are Strasberg-based teachers and Meisner-based teachers who work there. There's other stuff going on. You can learn Adler's technique there, but it's not the only thing they're teaching. And there aren't that many people. There aren't that many people who have gone on to continue to teach it today. There's just not as many as Meisner, Strasberg. They exist. The place where she's enormously influential is the field of script analysis and teaching of script analysis. Basically, if you take a script analysis class anywhere, it's Adler's technique of script analysis that you're studying.
And she was brilliant as an analyst of scripts.
And I will say, if anyone's interested in that, there are two collections of her sort of edited lectures published. One is it's both Stella Adler on, and then one is, the world's great playwrights, and the other is great American playwrights or something like that. And those are her lectures, some of her lectures on Ibsen and Shaw, Chekhov, Clifford Odets, Tennessee Williams, Edward Albee, those sorts of things.
Really worth reading. She's an inspiring,
it's life-changing
literary critic. She's a brilliant literary critic. Now, among recent actors, you have somebody who is almost virulently anti-method, but she gets the last laugh because she has more Oscar nominations than anybody else, and that's Meryl Streep. Yeah. What's her background?
Well, Meryl Streep, she's sort of the Brando that takes us away from the method, in that she's a mercurial genius like he was, who had a very flexible approach to technique. Meryl Streep studied at Vassar College, my alma mater as well. So go Brewers. And then she went to Yale. And at Yale, in her 3 years at Yale, she had three radically different acting teachers who taught radically different things. Well, one of them was Bobby Lewis, actually, towards the end of his teaching career, and he really didn't teach much at all. And then there was, like a method guy and an anti-method guy and whatever, and she just found none of that useful. She said in interviews, I wish I had learned some technique. There are times where having a fixed technique would help me. And so she was really opposed to the method on similar grounds to Stella Adler, that she just didn't feel a need to dig into herself and do all that shit. She was just like, I don't need to do that. I can cry on cue. Like, I can feel these things. I just don't need to do that. And so she's someone who's really adapted and made up, I think, new techniques when she needs them to suit the films that she is in and the projects that she is doing. So for Sophie's Choice, for example, she has a very De Niro-esque technique. She gains and loses weight. She wears false teeth. She learns to speak Polish and German. She does a ton of research, blah, 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 blah. But there's other films where she's not doing anything like that. From people I know who've worked with her or interviewed her, talked to her and stuff like that, I do get the sense that part of this is actually that she's a true genius and she's able to absorb techniques and ideas very quickly and easily, and she's a brilliant mimic. There's an interview of her, I don't remember where it is, where she suddenly says to the interviewer, like, oh, do you want to see a perfect back handstand? And then she just does one because she had like seen some people doing it and figuring out how to do it. Like there's a particular person who knows how to do that stuff. I don't think every Meryl Streep performance is great. I don't think every Meryl Streep performance necessarily actually serves the greater project of the film that she's in, but she does have a number of truly, truly incredible, brilliant. I mean, her genius is not up for debate, I think. And she really starts to show that you don't kind of have to do all of this malarkey in order to give a convincing naturalistic film performance. But I say malarkey as a joke because I believe in this malarkey, to be clear. But I'm saying, from her perspective, it's like, I'm going to be brilliant now. See, I didn't have to do sense memory. I can just be brilliant.
But if you are a genius, and there are very few geniuses, but if you're a genius like Marlon Brando and like Meryl Streep, let's say they're both geniuses. What can any teacher give them? Stella and Lee and Meisner can't impart a genius to Brando and Meryl Streep. The talent is there.
No, and Stella knew that and would say that, and I think it's Shelley Winters who said taking Marlon Brando to acting school is like taking a tiger to jungle school. Like the tiger's already in the jungle. He doesn't need to learn how to be in the jungle. I think what Stella gave Brando was faith in his abilities, trust in his intellectual capacity, because no one had believed that he was smart before her. She's really the first person to take his brain seriously. He learned a great deal from her. He learned politics from her. And I do think that he learned how to approach and think about text and the building of character from her. I think had he never studied with her, he still would have been a brilliant actor. But I'm just saying he did learn some things that were useful to him.
Did she shape his genius? Did she help to shape the talent?
I mean, I think that he would say that she and Kazan, he gave them both a lot of credit, that they helped shape the talent, to refine it and give it purpose. That, he's like an uncut diamond and they have to come in and refine it. Marlon Brando, I say this in the book, acting came so easily to him. He was so brilliant at it, but it wasn't the thing he wanted to do with his life originally. As a child, he wanted to be a jazz drummer. As an adult, he wanted to be a civil rights organizer. He didn't really, it was almost like he was cursed by his talent. Harold Clurman said, and Clurman knew him well because, when the Adlers kind of adopted Brando, Clurman was married to Stella Adler. Clurman knew him very well and said there's something in him that seems to almost resent acting. So it was sort of a blessing and a curse at the same time for him. And so I think one of the things she did as well in terms of shaping it was find ways to make it more of a blessing than a curse for a time, frankly.
So maybe we owe to Stella the streak of brilliant performances in the 50s. Maybe she centered him and focused him in the late 40s in a way that made possible those great performances.
I think that's part of it. She also helped launch his career by talking him up to everyone she knew. I mean, his breakthrough pre-Streetcar roles in a flop that Harold Clurman directs called Truckline Cafe, and Harold Clurman knew about him because his wife was his acting teacher.
Spending all this time on the book, and you've written a biography of the method.
Yeah.
In the end, Do you believe in the method?
In the end, I feel conflicted about the method. I think it's more interesting, as a writer, to live inside my negative capability and to write from that place than to write from a place of things that I know and that I'm certain about. I think the method is responsible for some incredibly great performances and some bad performances. It's responsible for some really great things. It's really bad things. It is unquestioningly changed American culture. Not permanently, because no change is permanent, but we still live, even though the method isn't dominant anymore, we still live with the taste the method gave us, with the idea of what good acting is that it gave us. And we still live with those fundamental dramaturgical tools that Stanislavski gave us, for example. But I do think that there's an aspect of the method and of the system that's always going to be aiming towards something that is ineffable and hard to explain. Experiencing is very difficult to explain. I read a whole dissertation trying to explain it. I didn't, I don't think it came out any better than experience, the definition that I gave you. Because it's very hard to describe. Creativity and the creative mechanism, very hard to describe. And so there's a part of it where we're never going to know whether it works or not, or how it works, that it's a mystery. And that's okay. It's okay to live with a mystery.
I think Stanislavski accepted that in a way that Strasberg didn't. Strasberg felt he could codify it totally. Stanislavski knew it was ineffable and ultimately beyond his reach. I think that's the fundamental difference between those two great progenitors of the method.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And, it's also, though, that ineffability is one of the reasons why both of them had such a terrible time trying to explain what they were doing. Stanislavski was going to write 8 books about acting. He completed 2 before dying. And they had to be sort of dragged out of him, kicking and screaming. Strasberg was going to write 5 books about acting or something, if I remember correctly. He didn't even finish one. A Dream of Passion was published after his death, and it's only possible because someone was able to take those lectures away from him and edit them into a recognizable form and turn it into a book. When I was doing research for this, I went to David Garfield's papers at the New York Public Library. You spoke with David for your book. He wrote A Player's Place, which is another wonderful history of the Actors Studio. And they're in those files. There's these lectures. Lee Strasberg's trying to write a book proposal. And so he gets together all these transcripts of this lecture and he gives them to David and he says, well, what do you think? And there's this very polite, gentle note from David Garfield where he's essentially saying, none of this shit's going to make sense to anyone, Lee. You have to actually write a book. You can't just take a bunch of things that you said and put it in a book. That's not a book. But he's trying to very gently, in a writerly way, coach him through how he could do it. But I think it took him dying for that book to get finished by someone else.
But people who attended his programs, his classes at the studio, said that it was sometimes very hard to follow his train of thought. Even the people who really appreciated him found some of his verbal curlicues extremely hard to follow.
Yeah. And if you read those transcripts, they're bewildering. They're really bewildering. He would just talk and talk and talk. I think that some of it came from, Michael Kahn, who I interviewed, who was a student of Strasberg's and admired him greatly as a teacher, but he would say that Strasberg would just filibuster because he didn't want to admit when he didn't know something. But which I think is, but I think often it's that he's really trying to find the most exact language to describe the thing he's talking about. And often the thing he's talking about is just beyond language. And so instead of gesturing to it, he's just going to keep going and going and going and going and going until eventually
it becomes less and less clear the further he goes. But we've been very clear, Isaac and Magda. I'd like to throw it open to questions from the house.
I have 2, one from Errol Rappaport. What does Al Pacino say about method?
Oh, well, Al Pacino's an interesting case because he's almost like a surrogate son to Strasberg. They were very close. Al Pacino's father, like many famous method actors of that period, abandoned the family when he was a kid. And he was homeless for a time in his teens, working at HB Studio. And eventually he made his way to the Actors Studio and really got taken under the wing there. Al Pacino is one of the most famous and important method actors of that period, but his method was not exactly Lee's. Al Pacino did not do a lot of textual analysis, and he doesn't really do effective memory work in the way that Strasberg taught. If you read profiles of Pacino from throughout his career, what he's really brilliant at is this weird process where he just absorbs the soul of someone else and then uses it for the character. So, the guy, someone was saying that on the set of Serpico, he's hanging out with the real life Serpico, and he's just sort of sitting next to him for a while. And he was like, it's almost like he just devoured Serpico and became him. So he has this, his process is almost mystical, but he is a very devoted, he was a very devoted member of the actor studio. He played on the softball league of the studio for many years. He was close with Lee. He's the reason why Lee Strasberg was cast as Hiram Roth in Godfather 2. He eulogized Lee at his funeral. He could not have been more deep into that or attached to it. He's the reason Robert De Niro comes to the actor studio, et cetera, and so forth.
All right, and Joe Batista asks, do you feel that the YouTube generation and the social media conscious acting students will still appreciate Stanislavski?
That's a really interesting question. The afterword of my book is in part about the impact of social media and YouTube and things like that, and what they might have on the impact they're having on the present day of our culture and the future of our culture. I do think there's room for Stanislavski within that. I think these ideas, they lasted a long time through a lot of different social changes. And so it's hard for me to believe that they're going to go away all of a sudden, and they've lasted through a lot of different challenges and a lot of different trends where people have said, oh, this is the next thing that's going to take over for Stanislavski, and it never does, right? It's like, for those of you in the theater world, I don't mean this as a knock against it at all, because it has its uses, but there was a period of time where it's like, oh, everyone's now going to do viewpoints. And we're going to forget about Stanislavski and everyone's going to do viewpoints. Well, is everyone doing viewpoints or are they talking about objectives again? So it comes and goes in waves. But to answer your question, I think it's going to be useful because I think that people feel really unmoored in this time. And I think the system and the various adaptations of it in the United States creates some real grounding. If it can feel sometimes like nothing is real. When I talk to I don't teach acting, but I think figuring out what's real is a real challenge for all of us, but also for my students. And that this roots you in something real that I think is important. The major challenge that faces acting, that faces all sorts of different areas of our culture, has shifted over the course of the 21st century. For thousands of years, the major force confronting and shaping acting is the limits of human perception. Can the audience literally see, hear, and understand what you are doing on stage? That's the fundamental question, actually, that shapes. There's all sorts of other artistic questions, but there's a reason why, for example, naturalistic acting begins to flourish once we have electric lighting and smaller theater spaces, right? It's easier to see what's going on. You don't have to do those big gestures. You don't have to project the back of that, or the back of the house is closer anyway. But we've solved the problem of human perception with microphones and cameras. We've really solved it, and we only get more and more sophisticated at solving that problem. So the new problem is the limits of human attention. And that's the thing that social media greatly impacts. And I say that myself as I'm sitting here being like, oh shit, I haven't checked Twitter in an hour because I've been doing this book event, that the limits of human attention are really being tested right now. And in some ways, what you choose to pay attention to, this is something that Stanislavski knew. What you choose to pay attention to is among the most important things that you can do as a human being and artist. His system starts with concentration and attention for a reason. And so I do actually think there's a weird way in which the solution to the problems of the attention economy lie in these theories. At least I hope they do, because hopefully there's some solution beyond we all have to deactivate everything and bury our phones in a lead-lined closet or whatever.
I don't have any other questions in the hopper.
Okay,
Sometime when we are off record, I would love to tell you my experience with Madeline Thornton Sherwood.
Oh yeah, tell me your experience with Madeline Thornton Sherwood.
Off of the record, but I'll turn it back to
Okay.
Okay, just to end, Isaac, since in doing the book you've really become a kind of aficionado of good acting, do you care to comment on good performances you've seen on film in the last year, or any of the Oscar nominations?
Yeah, I'll name a couple. I think Olivia Colman and Jessie Buckley in The Lost Daughter are doing truly, truly brilliant work. And what's fascinating to me about that is that neither of them are method trained, but stylistically, those are method performances, right? If anyone's seen The Lost Daughter, they're mysterious, they're mumbly, they don't, they're hiding things, they're repressed. There's always subtext. Everything they say has a lot of meaning. There's silences. There's all the key components of those kind of 20th century method performances, even though Olivia Colman trained at the Old Vic, so she trained in classic British theatrical technique. She got her start in sketch comedy. Jessie Buckley is a musical theater actor originally who got her start in a reality show competition in Ireland. And yet what they are doing, those are two of the great, stylistically, I'm not talking about technique, but stylistically, those are the two great method performances of the year. It's that thing that Ellen Burstyn, I think, said to you in your book, Foster, which is sort of like, the Americans won this debate because the British are acting like us now. Like their performances are like ours. I think what Andrew Garfield does in Tick, Tick, Boom is truly amazing and much, much harder than it looks, because he's playing a character with a big personality who's always performing. Like for other people, he's like a court jester, but it's very grounded in that character's emotional reality. And it always remains rooted in something, and that's really hard. I think Denzel Washington did good. I mean, I'm talking about people who are nominated now. I actually think there's a number of great performances in Macbeth. And I think that, Mike Faced in West Side Story, actually, most of all of the supporting cast of West Side Story is truly incredible. So those have been some of my favorite recent performances, but there's a lot I have to catch up on because I have a 7-year-old. I don't have enough time to watch Drive My Car. Now that it's on HBO Max, I'll watch it in 45-minute increments over the next week or something, because it's 3.5 hours long. But but those are some of the ones that I've been really trying. Oh, and a film that got no nominations that I think is a really beautiful and truthful film, Come On, Come On. Joaquin Phoenix is amazing in that, and Gabby Hamilton's great in it. And
no, I don't know that.
That's a wonderful film. That's a wonderful, wonderful film.
Now, just to come full circle, did you see Meryl Streep as the President of the United States in Don't Look Up?
I did see Meryl Streep as the President of the United States in Don't Look Up.
Very funny.
Yeah, she's very. I was not the hugest fan of that movie, but it has a truly remarkable cast of great actors in it who are all having a lot of fun. Yeah, I mean, yes, yeah, no, I know. I think she's great. Yeah. Yes, no, totally. I just didn't. My own annoyances about that film aside, I agree with you that there's a number of truly, the cast for it is incredible, and they're all having lots of fun, which is, I think, the fun of watching it.
Did you see Jessica Chastain as Tammy Faye, the Eyes of Tammy Faye?
I am not a huge fan of biopics. I try to avoid them whenever possible. So I have not actually
very
seen
good.
it. I'm sure she's great in it. It's just not a genre of film that I find rewarding. I'll be completely honest. And again, because of stuff going on with the book and teaching, and you have to find a babysitter, which was very hard during Omicron. There's a lot of things that I still haven't seen and need to catch up on.
Okay, we're going to end, Mark, but I want to tell people here's the book, The Method, How the 20th Century Learned to Act, by our guest, Isaac Butler. It is a terrific book. I know the subject because I wrote a sort of companion volume, if you will, and I learned a lot. So thank you, Isaac. I recommend the book very highly.
Thank you so much, Foster. That is like about the most meaningful praise I could receive. So thank you very much. And I hope you all enjoyed this talk.
Thank you, Isaac. It was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I can't wait to read your book, and I hope everybody else does, and hope to see you in person one day. Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Good night.
Good night,
everybody. Good night. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Isaac. Thank you. Thanks.